Well, we'll begin our second talk now on the question of conversion. What we're trying to do is examine the spiritual life. And we're trying to figure out how we can grow as human beings. My idea is to do that rather systematically and carefully, to look at ourselves in detail and in depth so that we can understand the deepest wellsprings of both the demons that assail us and the joys that are a part of our life. We want to try to figure out how we're going to do better in life, make progress, become more fully human, function more effectively. And I'm using this idea of conversion to get at this. Now, when we hear the word conversion, we often think about a turnaround. In fact, that's the root meaning of the word, to do a 180, a complete turnaround. But the fact of the matter is that as we're turning around, we do that in a process. We don't get from here to there immediately. We move through various stages. And so my approach to this is to try to look at that whole process of conversion. No, it's not a matter that we are converted once for all on a particular occasion, but it is a question of moving in that direction. And all of this is based on the religious conviction that indeed we are graced creatures, that the process of life can be trusted, that somehow we are in gracious hands as we do this introspective exercise and as we walk through our days, that we're not walking alone. There is this gracious mystery that surrounds us. There's a power and strength that enables us to keep going. We are in the hands of God, and God knows us by our name. And we are called upon, I believe, to make ourselves to be the best kind of person we can be. This is an obligation, a call, a demand from God that I think we all have to try to take seriously. Now, the premise of all of these talks is that we are multidimensional creatures. That is, we do a lot of different things functionally. So we get angry and experience joy and get anxious about impending events. You know, we can argue logically and reason systematically. We are rational creatures. We sometimes sin. We go against our conscience. And in other times, we can act virtuously. We are the people who can fall down on our knees and say thank you to the Lord, and also the people who search for meaning in the midst of all of the absurdities of life that assail us. In short, we have different functions. We are multidimensional creatures. And one of the things that we are able to do is to imagine. So we're the people who can transport ourselves into the past. We can take a scene when the sun was shining and we were at poolside and all was nice and blissful, and we can put ourselves back into that scene and feel all that went on at that time and remember it, bring it back to our consciousness. Now, we are the people who are able also to look back at the time when we made a fool out of ourselves, when we acted stupidly, and when we begin to put ourselves back in that scene, it makes us feel vaguely uncomfortable. So part of being an imaginative creature is that we have the ability to bring the past into the present for ourselves. But we're also people who can look forward. You know, we are able to imagine ourselves living in another way. We can dream great dreams and envision a new world of peace and justice, or think of ourselves functioning far more effectively. So another thing our imagination does is allowed us to project, to think of how it might be. What is it saying? Some people look and say, well, that they can't do it. Other people look at the possibility and say, why not? Why couldn't we do that? In other words, part of our power is to think of alternatives, to get ourselves out of traps and prisons in order to function more effectively. And we're the people who are able to be creative. That is, we can take the images that are in our mind and combine them and come up with a new way of thinking about something. a new way of imaging who we are. We can get creative moments when we can think of creating a more just society, a better world, new ways to relate to people. So those are some of the ways that I think that we prove to be imaginative creatures. And what we need to do is to be converted in that regard, to move from being having an unconverted imagination to finding a way in which our imagination works for us and helps us to grow and develop and to become more fully human. Now, as you know, I always like to deal with the stories of people and so on. And this time I want to use an historical figure that we know, and that is C.S. Lewis. Some people know him as the 20th century author of books like Mere Christianity or the Screwtape Letters or Miracles. Other people know him more from his imaginative literature, the Chronicles of Narnia. So C.S. Lewis, just to remind you a little bit, he was born in 1898. He had difficult years as a schoolboy. He eventually went up to Oxford, as they say, studied there. He got a first in the classics, meaning he was very bright, did very well academically. Later on, he became a don, or a professor teacher there at Oxford. He did that from 1924 to 1954. And then in 1954, he moved to that other place, to Cambridge, where he was a professor of medieval and Renaissance literature. And he died November 22nd, 1963, a familiar date, the same day that John F. Kennedy died, and Aldous Huxley as well. Now, what I'm interested in with C.S. Lewis is his imagination and how he functioned imaginatively and what clues he might give us about a converted imagination. By his own admission, as a youngster, he didn't play sports well, and he didn't know how to interact well with the other kids of his age. And so he lived in his imagination. That was the real world to him. He screened out all the rest of that world because really it was far too painful. But to live in his imagination brought him a certain amount of joy. As a teenager, he began reading Norse mythology. It's the kind of thing that Wagner used, as you might recall. He loved to listen to Wagner's music. And what he found out was that he felt a deep inner joy in what he called a stab of joy in reading that mythology. Again, that became sort of the real world for him. At the age of 16, he met a young fellow by the name of Arthur, a young fellow about his own age and so on, who helped him to appreciate the beauties and goodness of the imagination in the particular things around him. He gave him a feeling for the aesthetic side of life, the beauty that he could encounter in the particular, not just this far-off thing with mythology, but finding this joy as he was always looking for in the things at hand. And then he experienced what he calls himself a baptism of his imagination. I find that to be an interesting phrase. And what he really came to see, I suppose, was that he could find this joy without leaving the ordinary world, that he didn't have to escape from anything. His imagination could lead him to appreciating joy in the ordinary things of life. It gave him sort of a whole other way of thinking about how the imagination functioned. Oh, he had a lot of troubles establishing this insight. He went through a period of time when he sort of became very rationalistic. He took on the Freudian critique that all this stuff was it was just a projection and so on. But later on, he started reading poetry again, imaginative literature, and his imagination began to function properly for him again. Later on, as you know, he became a convert to theism, and then in 1931, a convert to Christianity. But what we want to see, the big point about C.S. Lewis is that he tells us in his spiritual autobiography called Surprised by Joy, was that the imagination became a tool for him to grow and develop. What he learned throughout was that when he tried to escape from reality through his imagination, it really didn't work. And when he tried to use his reason to stunt his imagination, to control it, and to make this deep joy that had often brought him happen again, when he tried to cling to it compulsively, it took off. It went away. He was not able to maintain that spirit of joy. And the other thing I see about C.S. Lewis and imagination is that it really was clearly a process for him that brought him to the point where he contributed this great imaginative literature, which again has touched so many people's lives. But he didn't get to that easily, but through a whole lot of struggle. Okay, that's something about a man that I suppose has made quite an impact. I would have some criticisms of C.S. Lewis as well. Part of the criticism is that he didn't really achieve an integration. That is, he had this marvelous imagination, wrote this marvelous imaginative literature. But when you read his theological writings, like Mere Christianity, for example, it all sounds sort of rationalistic. And you wonder where the imagination went. And that sets up a problem again in the converted imagination. How do we get it together somehow with our reason so it functions well? I don't think C.S. Lewis really found a way to mobilize his imagination in his theological quest or in his attempt to explain what Christianity is all about. Now, with that in mind, and priming the pump to remind us that perhaps we need a baptism of our imagination, or at least it's something we ought to look at because other people have found that to be fruitful. I want to turn to particular ways that we might try to convert our own imagination, or perhaps put it another way, allow the Spirit to enable us to move from the unconverted to the converted imagination. And first of all, I see it as a movement from escapism to the use of the imagination as a tool for renewal, for recreating ourselves. So we all know that our imagination can involve us in a fantasy, that it can move us away from reality. People can live in a dream world and therefore not function effectively at all. C.S. Lewis tried that. He went through a period where he was very big on sexual fantasies and living in that world. And he found out that that seemed to be detrimental to him in the long run, kept him from really dealing with reality. And so, I mean, we think of something like the general slick magazine approach to marriage that makes it all sound so romantic, and it's all going to work out just fine, and it's a panacea for life's problems. You know, it sets up an escapism from the real problem. So we end up with a lot of young people who think marriages are going to work automatically, or middle-aged people who are afraid to go to marriage counselors because they think there's something wrong with them if it's not going well. All of this would seem to me to have an unconverted imagination, to live in an escapist kind of world. And of course, what we want to do is the 180, or look at it in polarized terms to say, well, what would it look like if our imagination was converted? Then it would seem to me that our imagination would be helping us to live more fully alive, to be with it. In other words, our time away, if you're going to watch a soap opera, at the end of it, you'd come, and you did it properly, you'd come back energized for life. No, whatever we would do for escape in our life, it would end up energizing us rather than debilitating us. So we're looking for ways for our imagination to give us energy and strength so that we can keep moving along. We want our imagination to work for us so that we can be effective in the world, so we can make a difference, so we don't appear like dreamy people. That's one of the problems with Christians very often is when they talk about real life or they talk about their faith, trying to put it together, people say, well, what world does he live in? No, what's that got to do with getting up on Monday morning? So what we need is a way to get our imaginations in gear to deal with the real world. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, perhaps instead of watching a soap opera, one could read a spiritual book or some poetry, for example, that helps open up the depth dimension of life. So another thing that I think is important, that's liturgy, like celebrating the Lord's Supper and the Eucharist. There's a famous classic work, Leisure as the Basis of Culture, by Joseph Pieper, and he talks about liturgy as being something that touches us in the depths. Liturgy works on our imagination, first of all, not on our rational side. And it energizes us. When liturgy works right, we go and worship, and then we walk back out into the world ready to take it on with a better focus, more perspective, more energy working for us. So I'd suggest that good liturgy would be a way of energizing ourselves and really making this imagination converted from escapism to a renewed imagination. Now, I want to talk another aspect of how we would look at this conversion process. In this case, I've been thinking, I don't have good terms for this. Maybe I'll just have to describe it and we'll figure out some terms as we go along. But to be unconverted imaginatively would mean that we were excessively tuned into the bad things from the past. We would have a very selective range of images so that every time we imagined the past, we would always be back in those situations when we acted foolishly or didn't do what was right or just messed up in some way. We just automatically focus on that, always dredging up the negative from the past. It's a marvelous book by William Lynch called Images of Hope, where he describes the brainwashing techniques of the Chinese communists. And there were young American boys that they captured that they never tortured or did anything to, who just laid down on a bed one day and died. And the way they did that was forcing them to focus always on the negative and to getting rid of the support systems that they had. Now that's a very difficult thing, but it suggests that the unconverted imagination is always focusing on the negative. It's focusing on the 10% we don't like about ourselves. It's producing in us a poor and distorted self-image. Now, the converted imagination does not repress all of that negative stuff. It doesn't pretend that the 10% isn't there, or that I didn't make a fool out of myself sometime. But it expands, it opens up, it dredges up the positive things as well. It brings forth the 90% that I like about myself and that I do well. So that it seems as though what is needed for the converted imagination is to extend the range of material from the past that's encompassed by it, that it pulls in, that it sort of naturally brings to our mind. So we're not walking around with this poor self-image or this brainwashed sort of attitude towards life. Now, how are we going to move in that direction? Well, something that I propose to people often, and that is that we come up with a number of positive things from our past, little vignettes, times when we functioned well or we're proud of ourselves, and that we're able to bring those forward at will. We practice it, in other words. We work out a repertoire of 5 things like that. We can put ourselves in that scene, feel the sights and sounds and everything else that was going on, all the sensory data coming into us at that time. We can almost feel like we're in that scene. And we do that purposely, maybe once each day, run through our 5 things, in order that the imagination is sort of getting exercised so it can begin one way or another to bring forth the full range of experiences from our past. So we want to increase our introspection. I insist that this won't work by trying to screen out the time I made a fool of myself, to repress that or say, well, I wasn't that kind of person. The real way to do this is to expand so I also remember the good things that I did, the times when I acted virtuously. And then what this is going to help me to do, of course, is to come to the converted imagination where I am more in touch with who I really am, where I have a more adequate picture of the goodness that's in my heart as well as the sinfulness. Then the idea is that will help me to interact better with others, be more self-confident, and so on. The third aspect of this conversion process is to move from utopianism to constructive dreaming. Now, the unconverted imagination is dreaming things that are impossible. I think of Willie Loman in Death of a Salesman, Arthur Miller's great play. You know, he's out of touch with realities, dreaming these things that don't have any connection with things. You know, it's like me thinking I was going to be a major league ball player someday. You know, I mean, I couldn't run, throw, or hit. You know, I mean, how could this be? No, it's out of touch with reality. And so it's possible to sort of live that way, to be in a position of thinking, you know, I'm going to do these grandiose things, and then for being paralyzed because they're really not possible. I deal with students that way sometimes. I mean, they think they're going to do these great things, and you don't want to dampen enthusiasm or idealism, but somehow you got to get them in touch with reality and say you have limited capabilities, and you have to come to terms with all of that. And then when we think of the converted imagination and how the dream can function constructively, I immediately think, as everyone would, I suppose, of Martin Luther King's use of the dream. And what happens is that the dream energizes them. The dream is in front of us where we could live in racial harmony, and we sort of end up, when you hear it, you say, why not? Why couldn't I take a little step towards making that dream come true? It sounds realistic, or it sounds possible, or its motivating power is so great that we say, come on, I will really move into this whole sphere of action. So the dream, in my image, needs to be like a magnet. It's got to be close enough to reality that it's just far enough out in front of us, and the magnet has enough power to draw us forward. That's how our imagination should work. Not that I'm going to get rid of all my faults tomorrow, but maybe there's one fault that I could improve on during the Lenten period, for example. And I could see I could really do that. I can imagine myself living more constructively because that fault has been somehow dealt with. Now, how are we going to move in this direction from this unconverted utopianism to a constructive type of dreaming? Well, one thing I think we need to do is to listen to the prophets. That is, we need to listen to the people in our world who tell us that things aren't right, who point out the contradictions in the culture and in the society in which we live, the far-sighted thinkers who see things that perhaps we have missed. I think it's as well of a matter of saying no to the injustice, to the vices that are part of my life and character. No to that. It's what Herbert Marcuse called the great refusal, to say no to the negativities in life. I just won't abide those. I'm not just going to settle for the status quo. It's like telling people in a marriage where it's sort of mediocre, like, why do you have to settle for mediocrity? Why couldn't there be a step to make some improvement? No, why couldn't two intelligent people work at it together in a partnership and make it go better? Let's say no to mediocrity. Let's say no to vices and to negativities. That's what starts the imagination going. No, we're not going to live like this. Now we look for the alternatives. How is it going to be better? I think it's important for us to have reality checks. That is, confidants around, spiritual directors, a good group of friends who can say, you're out of line here. You know, what you're dreaming of is impossible. Or maybe on the other hand will say to us, you're in a rut and you haven't had an imaginative thought or feeling in years. You know, you haven't made any progress. But we need the close friend, the confidant, who would honestly tell us that. That's the only way I can see to really check ourselves, to have a community. That's one of the advantages of belonging to a church, for example. To be part of a church gives us a frame of reference. In our Christian faith, the kingdom ideal is always kept in front of us. Justice, peace, shalom, where everything is fine and beautiful and great, like God wanted it. It keeps us from falling into the rut and being self-righteous. It's saying there's always more to do. Let me take a fourth way of doing it. Here I'm calling it, let's be converted from being prey to the image makers in our culture to become people with an insightful imagination. To be unconverted in this way means that we're taken in by the world of advertising. All these images we're bombarded with, we accept uncritically. They begin to shape our consciousness of what the good life is, what beauty is all about, without us even knowing it. Politically, it means to let the image makers take over, to not think about policies, but to let the advertising people and the image of the politician be everything, and to lose any sense of substance. As one thinker said, it would be to be bombarded by the fireworks of visual commonplaces, so that we're watching TV or looking at the media or being in touch with the culture as a whole, and it's always so commonplace, so pedestrian, and we're unable to rise above that. When I think of the converted imagination along this way that uses images insightful, I think of Viktor Frankl. Some people know his logotherapy and how he survived in the death camps by imagining his wife and imagining that relationship. To use his imagination to keep himself alive and to find meaning in his life. It was a marvelous triumph of the power of imagination over the worst absurdity that the world can imagine. And it suggests that the imagination can be used critically, that reason can help us to use it. We could see through the world of advertising and wonder if we really need all those things that it tells us we do need. We could look through the image of the politician and arrive at something of the substance of the questions involved. How are we going to do that? Well, perhaps at times we could watch a TV program, switch it off, and then discuss it. Or watch a movie and ask ourselves what the images were that were at work there and whether we really end up agreeing with that. We could read criticism, people who criticize the arts, for example. We could do that kind of work so that we were able to cut through the images that we're always being bombarded with. Then I would like to talk finally here about moving to healthier images of God, because it is very possible to be caught up in very negative, heavy images of God, Christ, and the afterlife. An unconverted imagination is a heavy one. It's moralistic. It's weighed down by these supernatural ideas of a God who's going to punish us and a Christ who's nothing but a judge. And so the converted imagination means that we move beyond that we get healthier images of God. We're able to come to a point where we think of God as being on our side, walking next to us, supporting us in the causes, trying to create a more just world. God with us rather than over against us. Not a God who's testing us, but a God who's with us at every step of the way. Andrew Greeley, who's written some marvelous sociological pieces on this, he has a book called The Religious Imagination, has reminded us that healthy images of God are absolutely crucial to functioning well. It's not like, well, that's a nice addition to this talk here, but they're crucial. In fact, he says that they are the best predictors, really, of good behavior, of people who worship regularly, who are sexually adjusted, who function in terms of the social causes. So Greeley says that the concept of God, the image of God that we have, is crucial to living well. So the converted imagination realizes this and tries to develop these warm and more positive images of God. That whole analysis, of course, could be extended to thinking about Jesus Christ as well. Is he merely a judge, a divine being off somewhere aloof, or is he a model for us? Is he one of us in all things except sin? Does he Can I look at Jesus and see something about how I think human life ought to be lived? Do I get some clues or intimations from Him about what the good life is all about? Can I identify with Him in my sufferings and struggles? The converted imagination is able to do that, is able to take those images and make them work for us. Well, there's a whole lot of other ways I could talk about the converted imagination, but that might give you some idea of what we're dealing with. So what we're trying to do is to say the imagination is crucially important to us. We are people who can go into the past and project ourselves into the future. We're the people who have to live well in the present moment and find a way of integrating ourselves. And when we begin to look at how our imagination functions, you can see the distortions. We can get offline. We can become dull and deadened. We can become utopian people. And what we're asked to do is to move forward, to make the 180, to start moving towards that other kind of picture of the converted imagination, when we are now creative people, alive, where our dreams are keeping us on our toes, and where especially the great image of God as being the loving one, the merciful one, is with us, where Jesus Christ can guide us in the process. And then I think we can take on this process of conversion with a spirit of trust. We can say, I can look at the dark side and still accept myself. I can move forward because I know the great God is with me. Having hit 29 minutes on the nose, and having left out 3 sections of my talk, the usual procedure for new people is for me to remind you that you're welcome to come next week again. We're talking in another half-hour talk on the intellectual conversion, and bring a friend, and also a nice time for people to leave. For anyone who wants to stay, we'll spend another 10, 15 minutes now